Matilda Talbot had crossed the Great Plains twice before she turned 26, and both times she had arrived on the far side hollow-eyed and wind-burned, and no closer to understanding what it was she had been looking for in the first place. The first crossing had been in the spring of 1872, when she was 19, and her father was still alive, and their wagon was packed so tightly with his medical supplies, and her mother's good china that there was barely room for the two of them to breathe. They had gone west from Missouri following the promise of California, following the gold-bright rumors that drifted east like smoke, and what they found instead was a rocky plot of land outside Sacramento that refused to grow anything her father planted in it. Her mother had died of fever somewhere in Nevada, in a stretch of alkali flats so featureless it seemed to exist outside of time itself, and her father had buried her in soil that was more white dust than earth, and had not spoken more than 10 words together for the remaining 3 weeks of the journey. He lasted another year in California before his heart gave out quietly one morning in October 1873, and Matilda had sold the medical bag and the china both, and bought herself a seat on a stagecoach heading back east, because east was the only other direction she knew. The second crossing had been the following year, in 1874, when she was 21 and traveling alone, which in those days was a thing that made other women press their lips together and men look at her too long and too directly. She had taken work in a dry goods store in Independence, Missouri, saved her wages for 14 months, and then done the crossing again, not because she believed California held anything for her, but because she had begun to understand dimly that what she was looking for was not a place. It was something more elusive than a place. She thought perhaps she would recognize it when she found it, the way you recognize a word you have always known how to use but have never been able to define. She did not find it in California either. She found a boarding house in a town called Redemption, which was the kind of name that made a person either laugh or weep depending on the day, and she found work as a seamstress, and she found that her hands were good at mending things even when the rest of her felt irreparably frayed. She was 25 when she left Redemption, California, and started east again, though this time she only made it as far as a small town in New Mexico territory called Harlan's Creek before the wheel of the stagecoach cracked on a stone the size of a man's fist and threw them all into the red dust of the road. Nobody was killed. One man broke his wrist. Matilda stood up, dusted the front of her gray dress, and looked at the town of Harlan's Creek, the way a woman looks at a room she has just walked into and cannot remember why. The year was 1878. Harlan's Creek had a main street of hard-packed red dirt, a general store with a tilted porch, a saloon, a livery, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a hotel that called itself the Grand Sierra, though there was nothing grand about it, and the Sierra Nevada was several hundred miles away. There was also a sheriff's office with a hand-painted sign that had been bleached so pale by the sun that the word sheriff was barely legible. It was this last building that Matilda noticed most, perhaps because a man was sitting on the bench outside it, leaning back against the wall with his boots crossed at the ankle, holding a tin cup of coffee with both hands as though he was warming himself on a cold morning, though the temperature was easily 90 degrees. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting, a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 3 days, and the kind of quiet face that does not advertise itself. He was watching the wreckage of the stagecoach with calm, deliberate attention, the way a man watches something he is calculating whether to involve himself in. He was not young in the careless way of boys. He had perhaps 29 or 30 years on him, and they sat on him like wood grain sits in oak, part of what he was made of rather than something added to him. Matilda looked at him for exactly 1 second before she looked away, because she had learned that the West was full of men who misread a woman's gaze, and she was not in the habit of inviting misreadings. "You folks need the doctor," the man called, not moving from his bench. "One man with a broken wrist," Matilda said, before the stagecoach driver could answer, because she had assessed the injured passengers already and she was confident in her assessment. The man on the bench regarded her for a moment. Doc Hins is 2 doors down from the general store, white door. He stood then, setting his coffee on the bench beside him, and walked toward the broken stagecoach with the unhurried stride of a man who is accustomed to his own pace being sufficient. He crouched beside the cracked wheel and turned it with both hands, examining the brake. "Axle's fine," he said. "Just the wheel. Garrett at the livery can fix it by morning." "By morning," the stagecoach driver repeated, as though morning was a foreign country. "Unless you'd rather push it," the man said, and stood up and walked back to his bench and picked up his coffee again. Matilda was still standing in the road. She had her traveling bag over her shoulder and the dust of the road on her boots, and the particular expression she had developed over years of arriving in places where she had not intended to arrive, a kind of composed assessment, neither hopeful nor defeated. The man on the bench looked at her. "Hotel's got rooms," he said. "Mrs. Alcott at the Grand Sierra is fair with her prices if you're stranded." "Thank you," Matilda said. "Daniel Underwood," he said, as though her thanks had been an introduction. She paused. "Matilda Talbot." He nodded, as if he was filing this away somewhere useful. "You headed east or west, Miss Talbot?" She thought about the question for longer than it warranted. "I am honestly not certain," she said, and picked up her bag and walked toward the Grand Sierra Hotel, and she did not look back at him, though she was aware with some specific and slightly irritating part of her awareness that he was watching her go. The Grand Sierra had 6 rooms and a proprietress named Hazel Alcott, who was 60 years old, and built like a woman who had decided decades ago that the world was going to have to come to her rather than the other way around. She gave Matilda the corner room on the 2nd floor, which had a window that looked out over the main street and a bed with a quilt that had been washed so many times its original colors were a matter of speculation. "Stagecoach wheel," Hazel said, as though this was sufficient explanation for everything. "Yes, ma'am," Matilda agreed. "You're the 7th stranded passenger this year," Hazel said, not without a certain satisfaction. "Something about that stretch of road. You want supper, beans and cornbread." 50 cents. Matilda said she did want supper, and she paid her 50 cents and ate at the small table in the corner of the common room, alone except for an old man in the other corner who was asleep with his chin on his chest and his hat over his face. Through the window she could see the main street going golden in the late afternoon light. She could see the sheriff's office. The bench outside it was empty now. Daniel Underwood was somewhere she could not see, which was, she told herself firmly, entirely fine. She had been in Harlan's Creek for 3 days before anything happened that was worth noting. The wheel was fixed, as promised, by the morning after the crash, but 2 of the other stagecoach passengers had decided to travel on and 2 had decided to stay, and the stagecoach company would not send another coach through for a week, and Matilda had looked at the price of her hotel room and the coins remaining in her purse and made a quiet, practical calculation. She went to the general store on the 2nd morning and asked the man behind the counter, a broad, freckled fellow named Pete Sorrells, whether there was any work to be had in Harlan's Creek, by which she meant sewing or mending or any form of honest domestic work. Pete scratched the back of his neck. "Mrs. Galveston up on the hill takes in mending," he said, "but she's particular about who she shares work with. The saloon's always looking for." He stopped and looked at Matilda more carefully and seemed to reconsider the direction of his sentence. "There's the school teacher, Miss Pryor. She mentioned needing curtains sewn for the schoolroom. You'd have to ask her," Matilda asked. The school teacher, a thin, bright-eyed woman named Alice Pryor who was perhaps 23, hired her on the spot at a rate of 25 cents per panel, and there were 8 panels needed, and Matilda spent the 3rd day at the schoolhouse with a borrowed needle and thread, and the particular focused silence of a woman who knows how to make her hands useful. It was during this 3rd day that Daniel Underwood appeared in the doorway of the schoolhouse. He had a folded piece of paper in his hand, and an expression that suggested he was not entirely certain the schoolhouse was where he needed to be, but had decided to check anyway. "Alice Pryor in?" he asked. "She's teaching," Matilda said without looking up from her stitching. "The children come in at noon. She won't be free until 3. He leaned against the door frame and looked at the curtain fabric spread across the 2 front desks she was using as a work table. "That's the curtain situation she's been talking about since February," he said. "Apparently so." A moment passed. "You're Miss Talbot," he said. "I am." "You're still here," he observed, as if this was mildly interesting to him. "The next coach comes Friday." She bit off a thread. "And before you say it, I'm aware that's still 4 days away." He was quiet for a moment in the way that she was beginning to understand was particular to him. Not an uncertain silence, but a considered one. The silence of a man who does not speak until he has something worth saying. "There's no shame in being stranded," he said. "Half this town is here because of some accident they didn't intend." She looked up at that. He was watching her with those calm, direct eyes that she had noticed the first day and had been doing a reasonable job of not thinking about. His hat was in his hand, and the sun through the door behind him lit the edge of his hair copper. "What was your accident?" she asked, and was slightly surprised at herself for asking. The corner of his mouth moved. "Horse broke its leg in a gully 2 miles east," he said. "1873. I walked into Harlan's Creek carrying my saddle, and the town didn't have a sheriff, and the mayor offered me the job before I'd had a chance to sit down." "You've been sheriff here 5 years. She thought about that. "You must find it sufficient." "Some days," he said. He pushed off the door frame, settling his hat back on his head. "Tell Alice I'll come back at 3. It's about the Dunmore boys cutting through the schoolyard again." He left. Matilda looked at the curtain panel in her lap and realized she had been holding her needle still for the last 2 minutes of that conversation without noticing. She finished the curtains by Friday morning. She was paid $2, which combined with her remaining funds gave her enough for the coach fare and a modest cushion, and she stood in front of the Grand Sierra with her traveling bag, and the morning sun coming up red and enormous over the eastern hills, and she thought, east. She was going east. Back through the territory, back through Texas, back to somewhere that was not California and was not here. The stagecoach came at 9. There were 4 other passengers getting on at Harlan's Creek. Matilda was standing with her bag beside the coach when Daniel Underwood came across the street from the direction of the sheriff's office. He was not hurrying, but he was walking with some purpose. "Miss Talbot," he said. "Sheriff Underwood," she said. He stopped a few feet from her, and she noticed that he had shaved. She noticed it, and then she noticed that she had noticed it, and that was a nuisance. "I don't usually." He stopped and looked away down the street for a second, as though the words he needed were down there somewhere. "I don't usually make a habit of saying things like this to women I've known 4 days." He looked back at her. "But this town has a way of needing things and not knowing how to ask. Alice Pryor has been trying to get those curtains done since February, and she doesn't have enough money to pay a proper seamstress through the end of the school year. There's about a dozen other folks in the same situation. And Mrs. Alcott at the Grand Sierra needs a hand with the laundry through the spring." Matilda looked at him. "Are you offering me work or asking me to stay?" The honesty of her own question seemed to catch her slightly off guard, but she held his gaze. He met it steadily. "Both," he said, "and I'm aware that's a forward thing to say to a woman I've known 4 days." She looked at the stagecoach. She looked at the road going east, the long red road that would carry her back through territory she had already crossed twice and would deposit her somewhere she had already been. She thought about the question he had asked her on the first day, east or west, and she thought about her own answer, which had been honest and more revealing than she had intended. "I am honestly not certain. I would need a proper place to stay," she said. "Not the hotel indefinitely. It would have to be a boarding situation with a respectable family. The Hendersons on the north end of town take boarders. Sarah Henderson's a good woman. And the work would need to be consistent. Not odd jobs. I'll make sure of it." She was quiet. The stagecoach driver called out that they were loading in 5 minutes. "Why?" she asked Daniel Underwood quietly, not challenging, genuinely asking. "Why does it matter to you whether I stay or go?" He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not reach immediately for a convenient answer. Because you walked out of a wrecked stagecoach and assessed the injured passengers before anyone else had thought to, and you went and found work the next morning, and you've spent 3 days in a town you didn't intend to be in without complaining about it once. And because, he stopped again, the slight hesitation of a man who is being more honest than is comfortable. Because the town is better for having you in it, and I think you're still figuring out where you're supposed to be. I'm not saying this is it, but you might as well figure it out from here as from somewhere else. Matilda Talbot stood in the morning sun in Harlan's Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1878, with her traveling bag in her hand and the stagecoach waiting, and she felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, not like a door being thrown open, but like a key turning quietly in a lock she had not known was there. 5 minutes, she said to the stagecoach driver. He shrugged. She looked at Daniel Underwood. Tell Mrs. Henderson I'll need a room by this afternoon. He looked at her, and what she saw on his face was not triumph or relief but something quieter and more genuine, a kind of careful gladness, like a man who has asked for something he is not certain he deserves and is surprised to receive it. I'll tell her, he said. The stagecoach left without her. The Henderson house was a solid, practical building on the north end of Harlan's Creek, whitewashed once several years ago, and now faded to the color of old cream. Sarah Henderson was a 35-year-old woman with kind, tired eyes and 4 children, and a husband named Robert who worked at the livery and smelled perpetually of horses and honest sweat. They charged Matilda $2 a week for room and board, which was fair, and Sarah gave her a room with a window that faced west, which meant she woke each morning in shadow and watched the sky change color each evening in a way that was almost embarrassingly beautiful. She established her work quickly. Alice Pryor became a regular source of sewing jobs as the school year wore on. Word spread, as word does in small towns with the speed and thoroughness of weather, and within 2 weeks Matilda had more mending and sewing than she could comfortably complete in a day. Mrs. Galveston on the Hill, who Pete Sorrells had warned her was particular about sharing work, turned out to be particular in the sense of being extremely particular about the quality of stitching, and Matilda's stitching passed her examination, and Mrs. Galveston sent 3 of her friends along. She saw Daniel Underwood most days, which was the natural consequence of a town being the size it was. He passed the Henderson house on his morning rounds. He came into the general store when she was buying thread. He sat on his bench outside the sheriff's office in the evenings, and she passed it on her way back from delivering finished work, and they began to have conversations in the way that 2 people begin to have conversations when they are both slightly cautious and slightly drawn to each other carefully, and then more easily, and then in the way that feels, one day, like something that has always been happening. He told her about the town's history one evening in late April, sitting on the porch steps of the sheriff's office, because she had stopped to return a book he had lent her, a worn copy of Dickens that he had obtained from a trader 3 years prior, and read so many times the binding was soft as cloth. He had grown up in Tennessee, he said. His father had been a farmer, a quiet man who worked his land with a thoroughness that bordered on devotion. He had come west when he was 22, the year after the war ended, following the general westward tide that carried so many young men away from what the war had made of the places they came from. He did not say much about the war itself, and she did not ask, because she understood that some things a person carries in a closed fist, and the kindness is in not asking them to open it. She told him about her 2 crossings of the plains, and she told it more fully than she had told it to anyone in years, not as a list of places and dates, but as it had actually been, with the weight of the alkali dust and the sound of her mother coughing in the back of the wagon, and the particular grief of watching her father become a smaller version of himself with each passing mile. Daniel listened the way he did everything with full and quiet attention, and when she finished there was a pause that was not uncomfortable. 2 crossings, he said, 2.5 counting this one, she said. I got as far as here. Maybe here is the half that matters, he said. She looked at him in the fading light and he looked back at her. And there was a moment between them that was very quiet and very charged. And then one of his deputies came out of the office and called his name. And the moment dissolved back into the ordinary business of the evening. She walked home to the Henderson house thinking that Daniel Underwood was the most careful man she had ever encountered, careful in the sense of full of care, in the sense of handling things gently, which was a quality she had not known to look for, and which she found herself thinking about more than was strictly practical. May came warm and bright and full of the smell of sage and dry grass. The town of Harlan's Creek went about its business, the Saturday market where farmers from the surrounding land came to sell their goods, the Sunday services at the small church with its crooked steeple, the seasonal rhythm of a small western town in a territory that was still working out what it was and who belonged in it, and on what terms. These were questions that did not have simple answers in 1878. The Mescalero Apache people had been in this territory longer than the word territory existed, and Matilda had grown up in Missouri, knowing one version of that history, and arrived in the West to find the reality of it considerably more complicated and considerably more unjust than what the newspaper accounts had suggested. She saw it in Harlan's Creek in the way certain men talked about the land as though no one had ever held it before them, and she thought about her mother's grave in the Nevada dust, and about what it meant to lay claim to earth that was already full of other people's stories. She said some of this to Daniel one afternoon in May when they were walking back from Alice Pryor's schoolhouse together. It had become a thing they did, on the days he happened to be walking that direction when she was leaving. She said it carefully because she was not certain how he would receive it. He was quiet for a moment. I know a man named Solomon Reyes, he said. His family has ranched this valley for 3 generations. Mexican land grant predates the territory, predates most of the men who'd argue it doesn't belong to him. He has papers. Papers don't always help much. He paused. I try to do the job right. It isn't always the same as the job being right in the first place. She thought that was as honest an answer as she was likely to get from a man in his position, and she respected the honesty of it. You're a more complicated man than you look, she said, and surprised herself with her own directness. You're a more complicated woman than most people in this town realize, he replied, without missing a beat, and she felt the warmth of it move through her like the first real sun after a long gray winter. It was Sarah Henderson who said it plainly, the way Sarah Henderson said most things, one morning in late May over coffee at the kitchen table when Robert had already gone to the livery, and the children were not yet awake. Daniel Underwood is a good man, Sarah said, pouring coffee with the tone of a woman who is saying something that is both a fact and a question. I know, Matilda said. He's come past this house more in the last 2 months than he has in the 2 years before, Sarah said. Matilda looked at her coffee cup. I'm just noting it, Sarah said, in case you hadn't noted it yourself. I had noted it, Matilda said. Sarah nodded and drank her coffee and did not say anything more, which was a form of great consideration. It was the first week of June when the thing happened that clarified everything that had been quietly accumulating between them. It happened in the way that decisive things often happen, not with any particular announcement, simply as the natural consequence of circumstances arriving at a point. There was a fire. It started in the livery at 4 in the morning in the stored hay, and by the time the alarm bell was ringing and the town was coming awake, it had spread to the adjacent building, which was a storage shed belonging to Pete Sorrells at the general store. The whole north side of Main Street lit up orange in the dark, and Matilda dressed in 30 seconds and went down the stairs and out the Henderson front door with her hair loose down her back and her boots unlaced, because in a fire you do not stop to lace your boots. Robert Henderson had already run ahead. The town had a bucket brigade organized, the way small towns do, with the speed of people who have all thought about this possibility and know what to do. Matilda joined it, passing buckets from the trough on the south side of the street where the well was, passing them without stopping, hand to hand to hand. Daniel was at the front of it. She could see him through the smoke and the firelight, directing the water and keeping the men from going in too close, and she could hear his voice steady and clear above the noise of it, not panicked, not performative, just clear and functional and exactly as loud as it needed to be. The livery horses had been gotten out by Robert and two other men before the fire reached their stalls, which was the most important thing. The fire burned for 2 hours before they had it down. The livery was damaged heavily on the east side. The storage shed was a total loss. Nobody was hurt, which was the only thing that actually mattered. In the gray early light afterward, with the smoke still curling off the ruined shed and the bucket line dissolving back into a crowd of tired people, Matilda stood with a bucket in her hand and ash on her face, and her loose hair tangled with the night wind, and Daniel Underwood appeared beside her. He was sooty and his shirt was scorched at the right cuff where he had gotten too close to something, and he looked at her with an expression that was so immediate and unguarded that she felt it like a hand on her sternum. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "You burned your sleeve." He looked at it. "It's just the cuff." "Let me see it," she said, the seamstress in her already calculating the damage, and he held out his arm and she took his hand to examine the sleeve and then became aware that she was holding his hand. He became aware of it at the same moment. Neither of them moved for a second. "Matilda," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She had not realized until that moment that he had not used it before, and she had not realized until that moment that the lack of it had been a kind of careful restraint on his part, and its use now was therefore a significant thing. She looked up at him. The sunrise was happening behind him, pink and gold over the eastern hills, and the smoke was drifting west, and the town was settling back toward its ordinary self around them. "I know," she said, though he had not said anything else, and somehow that was sufficient. He did not release her hand immediately, and she did not remove it, and they stood in the ash-gray light with the smell of smoke and the sound of the town breathing around them, and it was the most quietly honest moment Matilda Talbot could remember experiencing in her 26 years of looking for something she could not name. What came after the fire was not sudden. Neither of them was a person given to suddenness. What came after the fire was a gradual deepening of what had already been quietly developing, a deepening the way light deepens in the west in summer, perceptibly but without abrupt transition, until you look up and the whole sky is a different color, and you cannot identify the exact moment it changed. He began to call her Matilda. She began to call him Daniel, though she had been careful about it before. He brought her a piece of pie from the hotel dining room one afternoon in a paper wrapping, leaving it with Sarah Henderson since Matilda was out delivering work, with a note that said only, "Apple, from the kitchen, D.U." She ate it at the kitchen table with Sarah watching her with a serene expression of great satisfaction. He took her riding on a Sunday afternoon in late June, which required borrowing 2 horses from Robert Henderson since Matilda did not own one, and they rode out east of town into the red and tan hills where the sage grew thick and the air smelled of heat and distance. He knew the land well. 5 years of riding its boundaries had given him a familiarity that was almost geographical intimacy, and he showed her the places he had come to know. A dry creek bed that ran with clear water 2 weeks in the spring, a mesa that turned the color of fire at sunset, a stand of cottonwood that marked an underground spring and was therefore always absurdly, improbably green in the middle of the dry landscape. "This is what I didn't know to want," Matilda said, stopping her horse at the top of a low rise and looking out over the valley below. The town of Harlan's Creek was visible from here as a compact cluster of dark shapes in the broad tan plain, small and human and somehow precious against the enormous indifference of the land. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, pulling his horse alongside hers. She was quiet for a moment, trying to articulate something she had been turning over for weeks. "When I crossed the plains the first time, I thought I was looking for something physical," she said. "A place that would feel right, a life that would fit." She paused. "The second time I knew it wasn't a place, but I still didn't know what it was, and I kept moving because movement felt like the same thing as looking." He was watching her with those calm eyes that she had come to rely on without realizing she was doing it. "And now?" he asked. She looked at the valley. She looked at the small cluster of buildings that was Harlan's Creek. She thought about the Henderson kitchen and Alice Pryor's schoolhouse curtains, and the feel of a good needle moving through clean fabric, and the way this man's voice had been steady and clear in the dark morning of the fire. "Now I think the thing I was looking for was not a place," she said, "and not a thing. I think it was a way of being somewhere, a reason to stop moving." She felt him looking at her, but she kept her eyes on the valley for a moment longer, because the honesty of what she had just said was sitting in her chest like something warm and slightly terrifying, and she needed a second before she could look at him. When she did look at him, he said nothing for a moment. Then, "I have wanted to say something to you for about 6 weeks, and I have been trying to find the right moment, and I'm beginning to think the right moment is just whenever I have enough courage." She held very still. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing. I know you're not from here, and I know you've been somewhere else most of your life, and I'm not asking you to." He stopped. "I'm asking if you'd like to find out whether this is the place. With me. I'm asking if you'd be willing to find that out." Matilda Talbot had crossed the Great Plains twice and had been searching the entire time for something she could not name. She looked at Daniel Underwood on horseback in the afternoon sun above Harlan's Creek, New Mexico territory, and she thought, "There it is. That is the thing I did not have the word for. He is the word I did not know I was looking for." "Yes," she said simply, "I would like that very much." He exhaled, and she realized he had been holding his breath, and the sight of him releasing it, this contained, careful man showing her that he had been nervous, moved her so thoroughly that she had to look at the valley again for a moment to collect herself. "Good," he said, and his voice had gone slightly rougher at the edges. "Good. Then let's ride back before the sun gets any lower." They rode back to Harlan's Creek in the gold of late afternoon, and Matilda was aware with every step of her borrowed horse that something fundamental had shifted. The way a landscape shifts when a cloud moves off the sun's same hills, same road, same sky, but everything suddenly vivid and warm in a way it had not been an hour before. Courtship in 1878 in New Mexico territory had its own conventions, and Daniel Underwood observed them with a seriousness that Matilda found both touching and faintly amusing. He called on her at the Henderson house on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, sitting in the front parlor with Sarah Henderson's careful and entirely transparent presence in the next room with the door mostly but not entirely closed. He brought her wildflowers that he gathered on his morning rides, which arrived in somewhat bedraggled condition because he carried them in his shirt pocket, which she found more endearing than a proper bouquet would have been. He walked with her to church on Sundays, which was a statement the town read correctly and responded to with the visible satisfaction of people who have been privately rooting for something. He was not given to grand statements or dramatic declarations. What he gave her instead was consistent, attentive presence, the kind that does not require trumpets because it does not go away. He remembered what she told him and asked about it later. He noticed when she was tired before she said so, and suggested they end the evening early without requiring her to ask. He was capable of silence in a way that most people are not comfortable silence, companionable silence, the silence that means I am glad to be here with you even though neither of us is speaking. She gave him back what she could, which was more than she had given anyone in years. She told him things she had not told Sarah Henderson or Alice Pryor or anyone in Harlan's Creek, about her mother and the Nevada dust, about her father's withdrawal into himself, about the particular loneliness of crossing a continent twice without arriving anywhere that felt like arrival. He listened to these things the way he listened to everything, with the full weight of his attention, and he said once, quietly, that he thought she was the bravest woman he had ever known, and she said that she was not brave, she had just never learned to stop. "That's what bravery looks like most of the time," he said. She thought about that for a long time. There were things about him that she was also learning, not just the large things but the small particular things that make a person real rather than ideal. He drank his coffee too hot and too strong. He had a habit of reading late by lamplight that left him with shadows under his eyes on certain mornings. He was not a man given to anger, but she saw once or twice the controlled restraint that meant he was managing something, and she respected the management of it. He was fair in his work in a way that was not universal in Western lawmen of the period. She observed this in the way he handled a dispute between Solomon Reyes, the Mexican rancher, and a newly arrived Anglo cattleman named Briggs who was attempting to run cattle across Reyes's water access. Daniel had read the documents carefully, asked both men to wait, consulted with the territorial judge who rode through Harlan's Creek on his circuit once a month, and ruled in Reyes's favor on the basis of the documented water rights. And Briggs had not been happy about it, but Daniel had been entirely unmoved by Briggs's unhappiness, which told Matilda something important. July moved through Harlan's Creek hot and bright, and the town went through its summer rhythms. The heat that settled in by 10 in the morning and did not lift until well after dark, the cicadas beginning at dusk, the particular quality of afternoon light that turned the red dirt of Main Street the color of old copper. Matilda's sewing work had settled into a reliable weekly income that more than covered her room and board at the Hendersons. And she had begun, tentatively, to think in terms that were longer than next week, had begun to think about whether a larger workspace might eventually be worth considering, whether there was sufficient custom in the town and the surrounding ranches for a proper dressmaker's establishment. She mentioned this to Daniel one July evening, sitting on the Henderson porch in the relatively cooler air of 9 o'clock, and he listened with the expression he wore when he was genuinely thinking about something. "Mrs. Finch's building," he said. "Which one is that?" "Down on the south end past the church. Small building, used to be a barber shop. Mrs. Finch owns it since her husband died last year. She'd sell it or rent it to the right person. Worth asking." She looked at him. "You've thought about this?" "I've thought about a number of things," he said, with a directness that was new even for him, and the weight of what he was not quite saying hung in the summer air between them, warm and significant. She chose to address it directly, because she was Matilda Talbot, and she had been crossing plains alone since she was 19, and she did not believe in speaking around things when you could speak to them. "Are you telling me you'd like me to stay in Harlan's Creek permanently?" He turned to look at her on the porch, and in the lamplight from the parlor window his face was entirely open, the careful man completely uncovered for a moment, no distance between what he felt and what she could see. "I'm telling you I'd like you to stay," he said. "I'm aware that I'm ahead of myself. I'm aware we've been courting for 6 weeks and that's not long enough by most measures to say what he stopped. Yes. I want you to stay. Specifically, I would like you to stay with me, which is a thing I'm saying too soon, and I know that." Matilda felt the warmth of it move through her like the first real breath after a long time of careful breathing. "You're not too soon," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about the same thing." He looked at her. "Have you?" "I have." She held his gaze. "I have been thinking that this is the first place I have been in 7 years that has felt like somewhere I could belong. And I have been thinking that a significant part of why it feels that way is sitting on this porch with me." The pause that followed was the kind of pause that has a great deal happening inside it. "Matilda," he said, and her name in his voice had the quality of something he was treating with great care. "I know," she said, for the second time since they had known each other, and again it was sufficient. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the Henderson porch in the July dark with the cicadas going and the lamp burning in the parlor window and the stars enormous overhead, and it was one of the fullest silences Matilda had ever occupied. He proposed to her in August. He did it on a Tuesday evening in the Henderson parlor, and he was serious and somewhat formal about it in the way of a man who is aware that he is doing something important and wants to do it with appropriate gravity. He got up from his chair and went to one knee, which was a thing she had not expected and which made her throat tighten unexpectedly, and he held her hand in both of his and looked up at her, and said that he loved her, and that he would like to spend his life making sure she never felt like a woman crossing an empty plain looking for something she hadn't found yet, because he would like to be the place she had found. She cried, which she had not anticipated either. She was not a woman who cried frequently. Years of traveling alone and managing her own difficulties had calcified something in that direction. But the specific tenderness of what he had said reached her beneath all her self-sufficient armor, and she felt her eyes fill, and she said yes before the tears could fall, which she felt was reasonably dignified in the circumstances. He stood up and she stood up, and he held her for a moment, the first time they had held each other fully, and she felt how solid he was, how genuinely present, and she thought that this was what she had been looking for. Not a person to save her, because she had never needed saving, but a person to stand beside, a person whose solidity made the world feel less provisional. Sarah Henderson, who had not been invisible in the next room, made no pretense of not having heard anything and came in crying with both hands pressed to her face and saying she had known since April. She had absolutely known since April, and Robert appeared behind her with an expression of great contentment and shook Daniel's hand with both his, and the Henderson children came tumbling down the stairs because they had been awake and listening. And the whole thing became warmly chaotic in the way that genuinely good moments do. They were married in September, when the heat had broken and the evenings were clear and cool, and the cottonwood in the dry creek bed east of town had gone gold. The ceremony was in the small church with the crooked steeple, which was full, not because Harlan's Creek was a large town, but because small towns attend their own celebrations with completeness. Alice Pryor sat in the second row and cried openly and did not seem to mind. Pete Sorrells from the general store sat beside Solomon Ray's, who had been formally introduced to Matilda in August, and had given them a wedding gift of a hand-carved wooden box that he said his grandmother had made, a gesture of such generosity that it moved her deeply. Hazel Alcott from the Grand Sierra Hotel was in the front row with a hat that was significantly larger than any other hat in the building, and an expression of absolute proprietorial satisfaction. Matilda wore a dress she had made herself, because of course she had ivory cotton with pale blue embroidery at the collar and cuffs, simple and well-made, the kind of dress that would last. Her hair was pinned up with small ivory combs that had belonged to her mother, and had somehow made it through 2 crossings of the plains, wrapped in a handkerchief in the bottom of her traveling bag. Daniel stood at the front of the church in his good gray suit, which she could tell he had pressed, and when she came down the aisle on Robert Henderson's arm, because Robert had insisted and she had let him, because it was kind and she was learning to accept kindness without bracing against it. Daniel's face did the thing it sometimes did when he was feeling something very deeply. It went very still, the stillness of a man who is not suppressing anything, but is simply trying to contain something enormous in an ordinary moment. The minister asked the questions, and they gave the answers, and Daniel's hands were steady on hers when he put the ring on her finger. A plain gold band he had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe, which had arrived the previous week, and which he had shown her in advance because he was not a man who assumed, and she had said it was exactly right, which it was. They lived in Daniel's house, which was a 3-room structure on the west side of town that he had added a second room to 2 years prior with the optimism of a man who is, on some level, hoping for company, though he had not admitted this even to himself. Matilda looked at the 3 rooms and saw what they could be with some attention, and she gave them that attention over the first weeks of their marriage. And the house became, not immediately but with the patient work of 2 people deciding to make a place there own a home in the full sense of the word. She rented Mrs. Finch's building in October, as Daniel had suggested back in July, and established a proper dressmaking and alterations shop, which she named simply M. Underwood, seamstress, with a hand-painted sign over the door that Daniel painted himself with considerably more enthusiasm than artistic ability. The letters were slightly uneven, and the whole thing was a fraction tilted to the right, and she thought it was the best sign she had ever seen. The work expanded quickly. Women came from ranches and farms within a 20-mile radius. Matilda hired a young woman named Consuela Reyes Solomon's youngest daughter, 15 and sharp and quick learning, as an apprentice, which felt both practically useful and genuinely right. And Consuela came in after school 3 afternoons a week and learned the work with a focused intelligence that reminded Matilda of herself at that age, before the crossings and the losses had made her practical in a different way. The winter of 1878 came mild and dry to Harlan's Creek, and Matilda and Daniel settled into the particular happiness of 2 people who have found each other after looking without knowing they were looking, a happiness that was not effervescent but deep, the kind that shows in small things. The way he brought firewood in without being asked, and she had coffee ready before he was fully awake. The way they read in the evening by the lamp, each in their own chair, occasionally reading a passage aloud to the other. The way he looked at her sometimes across the room with that expression, the open one, the uncovered one, and she looked back with the same. He told her things he had not told many people, in the winter evenings with the fire going. About the war, not the battles which he did not describe, but the afterword of it, the particular difficulty of being a young man who had seen something that could not be unseen, and having to go on with ordinary life carrying that weight. She listened without requiring him to say more than he chose to say, and she put her hand on his when the telling went quiet, and he turned his hand over to hold hers. She told him about the second crossing of the plains, which she had not described in full before, about the nights camped alone east of the Sierra Nevada, in the silence that was so complete it had a texture to it, a thickness, and about the particular kind of loneliness that comes not from the absence of people but from not knowing what you are moving toward. He listened, and when she finished he said, very quietly, "You're not moving toward anything anymore. You're here." And she was here. By March of 1879, she knew she was expecting a child. She knew before she was certain, in the way that a body sometimes communicates things before they can be confirmed. She told Daniel on a Sunday morning when the light was coming in clean through the west window of their bedroom and turning everything it touched to gold. He went very still, the way he went still with large feelings. Then he looked at her with an expression so entirely open and undisguised that she felt she was seeing the entirety of him at once, all the careful, contained, steadfast man at once, with nothing held back. "Truly," he said. "Truly," she said. He put his arms around her and held her, and she felt his breath against her hair, one deep, slow breath, the kind that carries everything in it. The pregnancy was not easy in the summer heat, but Matilda was not a woman who was easy to defeat. She continued working at the shop through June, Consuela Reyes taking on more of the physical work and proving herself thoroughly capable of it. Sarah Henderson appeared at Matilda's door approximately twice a week with food and advice, and the cheerful authority of a woman who had done this 4 times and was willing to be useful about it. Alice Pryor brought books. Hazel Alcott from the Grand Sierra sent over a bottle of tonic water that she claimed was beneficial, which Matilda accepted graciously and largely did not drink. Daniel was quietly, steadfastly attentive in the way that suited him best, present, practical, not hovering but never far. He built a cradle in the evenings in July and August from a piece of good pine he had traded 2 months of fence repair assistance to Robert Henderson for, and he was meticulous about it in the way he was meticulous about everything he actually cared about. It came out well, solid and smooth, with a gentle curve to the rockers that was more elegant than a man who described himself as only moderately skilled with wood had any right to manage. "It's beautiful," Matilda told him, running her hand along the edge of it. "It rocks level," he said, which for him was the primary evaluation. She smiled at him with the particular smile she reserved for moments when he was being most particularly himself. "It rocks level," she agreed, "and it's beautiful." He looked at the cradle and then at her, and the expression on his face was the full, open one. "I keep thinking about something you said," he said. "That first day, you said you weren't certain whether you were going east or west." "I remember." "I think about that a lot," he said, "that you almost got back on that coach." "I know," she said. "What made you stay?" He had not asked this directly before. "In that moment at the coach." "What actually made you stay?" She looked at the cradle. She thought about it honestly. "You said this town was better for having me in it," she said. "No one had said anything like that to me in a very long time, maybe ever." She looked at him. "And the way you said it, there was no angle to it. You just meant it." He held her gaze. "I did mean it." "I know," she said. "That's why I stayed." He crossed the room to where she was standing and put his hand against her face, his thumb along her cheekbone, and looked at her with everything open. "I am going to spend the rest of my life being glad you didn't get on that coach," he said. She put her hand over his and leaned into it, and the evening light came through the window and filled the room, and the cradle sat ready and waiting in the corner, and she thought, This is the thing I was looking for. Not a place, not a destination. This." The baby came in October of 1879, in the bedroom of the house on the west side of Harlan's Creek, with Sarah Henderson there and the doctor who had replaced old Doc Hins, a younger man named Dr. Calloway who had arrived in town in the spring. And it was long and hard in the way that first births often are, and Matilda was, as she tended to be with difficult things, both fierce and controlled about it. The baby was a boy. He was dark-haired like his father and had Matilda's particular expression of focused assessment from the very first hour, which Daniel found so immediately recognizable that he laughed, a full and genuine laugh that she had never heard from him at that volume, and which was the best sound she had ever heard. They named him James William Underwood. James for Daniel's father, who had been a quiet man who worked his land with devotion. William for Matilda's father, who had been a good man made smaller by grief, and whom she remembered with tenderness. James was a healthy, observant baby who took to the world with what Matilda privately characterized as professional interest. He slept in the cradle Daniel had built and woke at specific intervals that quickly became predictable, which she appreciated, because predictability in a newborn is a form of mercy. He was 2 months old when he first looked up at his father's face with an expression of such complete and solemn recognition that Daniel went very still with the weight of it. "He knows you," Matilda said from across the room. "It appears so," Daniel said, in the voice he used when he was containing something large. He was holding James with the careful confidence of a man who has understood quickly that babies, like everything else he truly cares about, need to be handled with full attention. "Hello, James," he said softly, and the baby regarded him with those focused eyes. "You're going to be fine," Daniel told him. "You're absolutely going to be fine." Matilda looked at her husband holding their son and felt something move through her that did not have a word for it in any language. She knew something total and warm and rooted, the feeling of a woman who has arrived, fully and finally, at the place she was supposed to be. The year 1880 came, and the town of Harlan's Creek kept growing. A second general store opened, and then a proper doctor's office, and a newspaper called the Harlan's Creek Courier that printed once a week and featured an editorial sensibility that was occasionally irritating but generally decent. The railroad was making its way through New Mexico territory, and there was talk, increasing talk, that a branch line might come through within a few years, which would change the town's character significantly, and about which Matilda had mixed feelings. Her shop, M. Underwood Seamstress, had expanded. She had taken on a second apprentice, a girl named Patience Green, 17, whose family had come down from Colorado, and who had a natural eye for proportion and color that Matilda recognized and cultivated. Consuela Reyes had been with her 2 years now and was skilled enough to handle the simpler commissions without supervision. The shop had become, in a way Matilda had not entirely planned but entirely welcomed, a kind of gathering point for the women of Harlan's Creek and the surrounding area, a place where you came to get your dress hemmed and stayed to talk, where information moved and problems were aired, and the kind of practical female solidarity that Western towns ran on, often without acknowledgement, was quietly practiced. She continued to think about the injustices she observed, the slow erosion of Ray's family land rights that continued despite Daniel's rulings, because the law was one thing and the pressure of arriving Anglo cattlemen was another. She thought about Consuela, who was brilliant and who would have limited access to the formal education that her intelligence deserved, because the territory's provisions for certain of its populations were inadequate and everyone knew it. She thought about what she could do about these things, which was not nothing. She paid Consuela well and trained her thoroughly, and wrote a letter in 1880 to a women's educational society in Santa Fe that she had heard about, inquiring about correspondence courses that might be available, and she mentioned Consuela by name as a candidate of exceptional ability. She did not know whether anything would come of it. She did it anyway. Daniel was re-elected sheriff of Harlan's Creek in the fall of 1880 without opposition, which was a thing that quietly moved her, because it meant the town continued to trust him with its safety and its fairness, and she had seen enough of how he did the work to know that trust was not misplaced. They had their second child in 1881, a daughter they named Clara. Clara came into the world with considerably more speed and authority than James had, which made the birth easier and gave them both a very clear early indication of her personality. She was not a quiet baby. She was not going to be a quiet child or a quiet person, and Matilda held her in the first hour and thought, "Good. Good for you, Clara. Go ahead and be as loud as you need to be. Lord knows I was too quiet for too long." James was almost 2 when Clara arrived and approached the new baby with the same solemn, focused assessment he brought to everything, which by now was fully recognizable as the Talbot concentration translated through a new generation. He was a gentle child, and he was careful with her in the way of a small person who has been treated carefully and therefore knows how it works. Daniel, watching his son examine his new daughter with such grave and tender attention, said quietly to Matilda, "He's going to be all right, that boy." "He's going to be wonderful," Matilda said. "He gets that from you," Daniel said, and she looked at him. "He gets it from both of us," she said firmly. The corner of his mouth moved. "Both of us," he agreed. The years that followed moved through Harlan's Creek with the particular quality of years that are full without being eventful in the dramatic sense, full of the texture of real life, of seasons and work and the small accumulations of a family being built. James learned to walk and then to run, and then to ask questions with a relentlessness that was both exhausting and deeply charming. Clara learned to walk sooner than expected and immediately applied this ability to getting into everything she had previously only been able to contemplate. The house on the west side of town gained a 4th room, which Daniel and Robert Henderson built together over 2 weekends in the spring of 1882 because it was needed. Alice Pryor, who had remained one of Matilda's closest friends through all of this, married a farmer named Tom Hartley in the spring of 1882, and Matilda made her wedding dress, which was the finest piece of work she had done to date, pale cream with intricate embroidered flowers at the neckline that took her 3 weeks. She would not hear of being paid for it. The shop continued to grow. By 1883, Matilda had 3 regular employees, Consuela, Patience, and a 3rd woman named Ruth, and the correspondence with the Santa Fe Educational Society had produced results. Consuela was enrolled in a correspondence program in business and accounting that she pursued with the same focused intelligence she brought to sewing, and which Matilda felt quietly, fiercely good about, in the way of a person who has done something small that is, in some future she will not see, significant. Solomon Reyes came to the shop one afternoon in the fall of 1883 to pick up a dress his wife had ordered, and while he was waiting, he talked with Matilda about the state of the land dispute that was never fully resolved, the pressure on his family's water rights that kept coming back in new forms despite Daniel's repeated rulings. She listened and felt the particular helplessness of someone who understands an injustice clearly and has limited power to address it. But she also knew that Solomon knew Daniel would keep ruling right, and that this mattered even if it was not enough. "He is an honest man, your husband," Solomon said. "He is," she agreed. "There are not so many of those," Solomon said. "No," she said. "There are not." Daniel came in from the main street just as Solomon was leaving, and the two men shook hands with the easy, mutual respect of people who have dealt honestly with each other over years, and Matilda watched them from behind the counter of her shop and thought about the particular shape of this life she had stumbled into, its textures, its complications, its beauty, its imperfect and genuine goodness. The railroad came to Harlan's Creek in 1884, not on the main line but a branch, just as the earlier talk had suggested. It changed things, as she had predicted, with mixed feelings brought in more people, more commerce, more of the outside world with its energies and its complications. The town grew perceptibly. New businesses arrived. The Grand Sierra Hotel, which Hazel Alcott sold in 1884 to a businessman from Denver who renovated it substantially and removed the name Grand Sierra in favor of the more grandiose Hotel Harlan, became something different than it had been, though Matilda privately missed the version where Hazel had sat behind the desk and surveyed all arrivals with sovereign competence. Hazel Alcott retired to a small house at the south end of town and became a fixture at Matilda's shop, appearing most Tuesday mornings to collect whatever alterations she had brought in the previous week and to drink coffee and offer opinions, which were always specific and often correct. She was 70 now and had earned the right to her opinions entirely. James started school in 1885, presenting himself on the first day of the new school year with an air of readiness that made his mother feel something complicated and warm. He had her ability to assess situations quickly and his father's instinct for knowing when to speak and when to be quiet. And Miss Carpenter, Alice Pryor Hartley's replacement, since Alice had left teaching after having her first child, wrote home at the end of the first month that James was a delight to teach and showed a remarkable attention for his age. Clara started 2 years later and showed up with her own opinions about the whole enterprise, which was to say she found aspects of it good and aspects of it requiring improvement and said so. Her teacher sent home a different kind of note, which Matilda read to Daniel at the kitchen table, and which made them both try not to laugh. "She's going to be something," Daniel said. "She is already something," Matilda said. "She is quite specifically and completely something already." He looked at her across the kitchen table with the open expression, the uncovered one, and said, "I used to think I'd crossed about as much of my life as I was going to cross alone. I thought that was just what there was." She set down the note. "And now I think about the fact that you almost got on that stagecoach and my heart still does something specific and unpleasant." He held her gaze. "And then I think about what actually happened and it does something else entirely." "What does it do?" she asked softly. He looked at her, and James's schoolwork was spread on the table between them, and Clara was asleep upstairs, and the lamp was burning against the evening dark, and the smell of supper was still in the air. "It does something that doesn't have a word," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "I know," she said. Third time she had said it. She thought she would probably keep saying it for the rest of her life as the occasion arose, because it kept being true. His hand turned over and held hers, warm and certain, the way it always was. The spring of 1887 was particularly beautiful in Harlan's Creek. The winter had been wet enough to bring out flowers in the desert that appeared only in certain years, and the hills east and west of town were streaked with color in late March and early April, yellows and pinks, and a particular fierce red that she had never seen anywhere else, and that she had come to think of as specifically belonging to this place. She rode out on a Saturday morning with Daniel on the horses they now owned, a good bay for him and a steady roan mare for her, and they went up into the eastern hills above the town the way they used to go in the early years, and the view from the rise was the same as it had always been. The valley below, the town compact and human in the broad plain, the enormous sky. They stopped at the top of the rise, as they always did. "The first time we rode up here," she said, "you asked what I meant when I said I didn't know to want this." "I remember," he said. "Do you remember what I said? That you thought the thing you were looking for wasn't a place," he said. "And that you kept moving because movement felt like looking." She looked at him. 9 years since that first August ride. 9 years of this man, this town, this life. 2 children sleeping in the house below them at this moment, with Sarah Henderson's daughter watching them, because the Henderson children were grown now, and Sarah's oldest girl had taken up babysitting as her own small enterprise. "I want you to know," Matilda said, and stopped and started again. "I want you to know that I was right. It wasn't a place, and when I found it, it was exactly as I thought. I didn't recognize it immediately. I just felt it, the way you feel a word you've always known how to use. And I want you to know that I have never for one moment since that Tuesday evening when you got up from your chair and went to your knee, never for one moment doubted that I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Daniel Underwood looked at his wife in the spring morning above Harlan's Creek, with the flower-colored hills behind her and the blue sky enormous over everything, and he said nothing for a long moment. "Matilda," he said finally. "I know," she said. "No," he said, with the faint edge of a smile that she loved so specifically and completely. "This time let me say it," she smiled. "All right. You crossed those plains twice," he said. "And I have thought about that a great deal over the years, about what it takes to do that twice, alone, looking for something you could feel but not name. And I think that is the bravest and most human thing I know. And I think that the stagecoach wheel cracking on that road was the best accident that ever happened in this territory. And I think," he paused, "and the careful man was entirely gone, and there was only Daniel, open and complete. I think you were always going to find it. I think you would have found it without me. But I am so profoundly grateful you found it here with me that I don't have adequate language for it." She felt her eyes fill, because she was not too calcified for that anymore. He had worn away the last of that particular armor over the years, not by force but by persistent, consistent tenderness, and she was glad to be without it. "Come here," she said. He moved his horse alongside hers, and she reached across and took his face in her hands and kissed him in the spring morning above the valley, which was a thing she did not think she would ever stop finding remarkable, that she got to do this, that this was a thing available to her, this man and this warmth and this certainty. When she pulled back, he caught her hand and held it. "Let's go home," he said. "Let's go home," she agreed. They rode down from the hills into the valley, into the town of Harlan's Creek in its spring flowers, down the red dirt road that she had first walked into 9 years ago with ash on her face and a traveling bag over her shoulder, and no clear idea of where she was going. The town came up around them as they rode: the general store, the church with its crooked steeple, the building on the south end that bore the tilted, imperfectly lettered sign M. Underwood seamstress, the sheriff's office with its bench outside where a man named Daniel Underwood had once been sitting with his coffee and his calm eyes, watching the wreck of a stagecoach with the unhurried attention of a man who was calculating whether to involve himself. He had involved himself. She had let him. The house on the west side of town was ahead of them, 4 rooms and a porch, and a kitchen garden that Matilda had planted 2 springs ago with more optimism than horticultural expertise, but which had produced, against reasonable expectation, a genuinely useful quantity of tomatoes and beans. The roan mare knew the way and moved toward it with the confidence of a creature who has arrived home enough times to have formed an opinion about it. James was on the porch when they came up the road, 7 years old and solemn-faced, watching their approach with that focused attention that was so entirely his mother's, and yet entirely his own. He had a book under his arm. He had discovered books in the way of a person who recognizes something they have always needed, and he lifted one hand in greeting in the minimal way that was, already at 7, so entirely his father. "Mrs. Henderson's daughter made biscuits," he announced, when they were close enough for normal speech. "Did she?" Daniel said. "They are very good," James said, with the authority of direct experience. "Clara already had 3. "Of course she did," Matilda said. From inside the house came the sound of Clara's voice, raised in what was either a song or an argument with the biscuit situation, and it was impossible to tell which without more information, but it was entirely Clara regardless. James looked at the window, and then at his mother with an expression of brotherly forbearance, so precisely calibrated that Matilda had to look away to keep from laughing. She dismounted, and Daniel was already off his horse, and he took the reins of both and led them toward the small stable at the back of the property. And James fell into step beside her as she walked toward the porch, and she put her arm around his shoulders, and he leaned into her in the unself-conscious way of children who have never doubted they were entirely welcome in the world, and she thought, "I made that. He has never once doubted his welcome in the world. We made that, Daniel and I, out of 2 people who had learned to move through the world braced for the cold of it." The screen door opened and Clara appeared with biscuit evidence on her chin and an expression of profound contentment. "Mama," she said, "there are biscuits." "So I hear," Matilda said. "They are excellent," Clara confirmed. Matilda climbed the 2 steps to the porch and opened the screen door and went inside, into the smell of biscuits and the afternoon light coming through the west window the way it had every evening since they'd moved in, golden and warm and particular to this house, this town, this life. Daniel came in from the stable a few minutes later, his hat off and his hair somewhat disheveled from the ride, and he washed his hands at the basin and came to the kitchen table where she was already pouring coffee, and he sat down across from her the way he had sat down across from her hundreds of times in this kitchen, and she set his cup in front of him, and he looked up at her with the open expression. "Good morning," he said, though it was well past noon, because he said it sometimes just to say it, just as a way of beginning again from the start, just as a way of being in the morning of things even when the calendar said otherwise. She sat down across from him. The children were somewhere in the back of the house, Clara's voice rising and falling in whatever occupation had engaged her. James's quieter presence felt rather than heard. "Good morning," she said. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Through the window the west-facing light was beginning to shift toward the gold of the late afternoon, and outside the kitchen garden was doing its optimistic best with the beans, and on the table between them was James's schoolwork and Clara's drawing from the previous day of what she claimed was a horse, but which bore more resemblance to a very small building, and the ordinary, extraordinary, specific, irreplaceable texture of their life. Matilda Talbot had crossed the Great Plains twice looking for something she could not name. She had found it here, in this kitchen, in the hands of this man, in the voices of these children, in the particular quality of this light. She had found it in a town she had arrived in by accident, in a life she had not planned, with a person she had not known she was looking for until she saw him on a bench with a cup of coffee, watching the wreck of a stagecoach with eyes that were calm and brown and seeing. He was the name she had not known she was looking for. And she had been looking for it since before she knew that names like that existed, since before she understood that a person could be a destination, that you could cross the whole of the American West twice over and arrive finally not at a place but at a person, not at a longitude but at a life. She set down her coffee and reached across the table, and he reached back and their hands met in the middle of the kitchen table, with the ease and certainty of two people who have been reaching for each other for 9 years and have never once missed. Outside, the late afternoon sun turned the red dirt road of Harlan's Creek to copper, and the hills went gold, and the sky went pink, and the cottonwood east of town, which always ran impossibly green, caught the last of the light and held it. And inside the house on the west side of town, two people who had both arrived in Harlan's Creek by accident and stayed by choice sat across from each other in the warm kitchen and held hands across the table, and were home. Completely, entirely, without remainder home.